A third hindrance is the habits we have been unable to break. Habits that feed the fleshly nature and have no spiritual impact. And some of which are not necessarily ungodly. They're just the patterns of our life where we find comfort, but they really do nothing to cause spiritual growth in our life. You know, I was watching Jack Hayford a couple weeks ago, and Jack Hayford was talking about this it was a Sunday night, and he was talking about the whole aspect of pressing in with God and letting God develop us more and more. And Jack Hayford was saying that God kind of by his Spirit spoke into his own heart and said that God was saying, I want to take you on a spiritual journey, a deeper spiritual journey. Now, Jack Hayford's a man that I highly respect. And he was saying, you know, that, okay, Lord, I'm willing to go. Whatever you desire to do, take me into the depths that you want to take me. And it was as if the Lord was challenging Jack Hayford to give up some of his television time. And Jack said that he doesn't really spend a lot of time in front of the television, and it wasn't that he was watching anything ungodly, or you know, anything that he shouldn't be watching, but God was saying, listen, I want you to surrender that habit of watching television where you would typically go home and sit in your easy chair and kind of get some comfort out of whatever you're watching. You know, I want you to surrender that because I want to take you on a spiritual journey. And so what Jack Hayford said was for him to go on this spiritual journey with the Lord, he was being asked to give up that old habit of just going home and doing that, tucking himself away and gaining that kind of pleasure that came out of watching that, whatever it was, you know. And so sometimes it's not sinful habits I'm talking about, but just the habits that are part of our course, although they do nothing to maybe pull us down, they do nothing to build us up either. Now, a second aspect are those habits that violate the sanctity of our physical temple and cause a divide between our fleshly nature and our spiritual man. And I realize that we don't often talk about this in church, but because we kind of like to stay guarded. You know, we'll talk about other things in regards to sin, but we won't talk about the things like gluttony. Because we like to go to our mega salad bar, buffet bars. And I'm waiting for them to put a Golden Corral in the area, but it hasn't happened yet. But, you know, we have this, you know, things like gluttony or smoking or consuming alcoholic beverages, things that aren't necessarily going to keep you out of heaven, but do damage your spiritual walk. We used to have a pastor who said, smoking's not going to keep you out of heaven. It'll just make you smell like, smoking's not going to send you to hell and just make you smell like you've been there. Is what he used to say. You know, so there are those things that sanctify the spiritual temple. There are things that violate the sanctity of the spiritual temple and cause a divide. And those are the things that we have to give up, those habits that would cause us, that keep us from going deeper with God. Others, habits that we must surrender are those things that are carryovers from our lives before Christ that we are unwilling to surrender. Maybe things like anger or lust. And I'm not thinking, you know, so often we think about lust, we think about a guy, you know, who's lusting after a woman. But you know what? When you walk down the mall, those storefronts are all set up, and mostly it's not guys, most of the time it's women, to cause the lust of the eye to look at that. I need that dress. I need that jewelry. I need those shoes. I won't even go there. Some of the looks I'm seeing. So whether it's anger or lust or the viewing of pornographic material or foul language or pride or whatever it may be, those things that are carryovers necessarily, carryovers from our life without Christ, our life before Christ. I'm talking about habits that probably won't keep us out of heaven, but they do slow down the spiritual growth of our lives. And Paul lists them in his letter to the church at Galatia as the works of the flesh, and he contrasts them against the fruit of the Spirit. They're the things that continue to creep into our lives and our walk with God that stunt spiritual growth. Paul said to one of the most Pentecostal churches of his day, a church that should have been much further along in its spiritual growth, one that spoke in tongues and had the gifts in operation, and he calls them on this, and he calls them on this very thing, and he says to them as he opens the 3rd chapter of his letter to the church at Corinth, he says, "Brothers, I could not address you as spiritual, but as worldly, mere infants in Christ. I gave you milk, not solid food, because you are not ready for it. Indeed, you are still not ready. You are worldly. And so he's saying to them, listen, although you're believers, although you confess Christ, although you walk in the gifts, although you're Pentecostal in nature, you are still very much of the flesh. You are still worldly. You still allow the things of the world, and you ought to be further along. So Paul is saying it is our old ways, our old habits, our old desire to feed the flesh and be a part of the world that keep us from spiritual growth. Truth is, we face that same challenge. We have to ask ourselves, how much do I want a real relationship with Jesus? How important is spiritual growth to me? How important is it that I get to the next level? How much do I want to really look like Jesus?